The average American earns about 4,000 US dollars a month. That's about 48,000 annually. Can you guess how much the average Southeast Asian earns? The average Malaysian earns $715 a month. The average Filipino earns $367 a month. The average Filipino earns about 13 times less than an average American. The average Malaysian earns about 5 times less than an average American. Much more challenging for an average Indonesian. So with such income disparity, are we able to build successful and meaningful businesses here in Southeast Asia? My name is Jeffri Cheong, and I'm the co-founder and managing director of Kaodim. We're a services marketplace that connects people to professional service providers from cleaners, contractors, plumbers, electricians, photographers, and more. We're a vertical-focused marketplace for certain sectors where we manage the transaction from end to end, and we're a horizontal-focused marketplace for other services. We've raised $12 million in the last 3 years, started in 2015, and we're now operating in Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore. So I'm going to talk to you about the Southeast Asian paradox. I'm going to talk to you about the expectations that we all had in these rooms as venture capitalists and founders in building our Southeast Asian unicorns, or trying to build our unicorns, and the realities that we're actually facing while we're building our businesses. So the expectations for all of us in this room here, as VCs and as founders, is to have high growth, high revenues, high profitability, or a quick path to profitability. And we want all of this very, very quickly while keeping costs extremely low. Now the question is, does the Southeast Asian consumer contribute to our abilities to meet these expectations? Let's follow the journey of an average 30-year-old in Malaysia, for example. The typical Malaysian 30-year-old will live with his family or her family until they get married. That's about the age of 25 to 30 on average. So that means it's a joint household for a significantly longer period of time versus our Western counterparts. 3/4 of the population does not have a tertiary education. They start their salaries at $745 a month. Once they've moved out and they've started to have their own children and build their own families, all their financial commitments and obligations go towards raising their family. It's quite typical for them to support their children from primary education all the way up to university. Typically, Malaysians like to own homes as well, so a lot of money is probably going to go into investing into their homes and servicing their mortgages. At the age of 45, the salaries only peak at about 4,000 US dollars a month, and they retire at 65 with a life expectancy of 75 years old. So that's not a lot of time for a lot of Malaysians, the typical Malaysian, probably not a lot of you in this room, but the typical Malaysian out there, for them to consume expensively and luxuriously. Let's look at the average Indonesian in Jakarta. Similar attributes in terms of what they want to spend their money on, what their financial commitments and obligations are, but they start much lower at $278 a month. They only peak at 3,500 US dollars at the age of 45, and they retire even much earlier at age 56, and life expectancy is even lower in Indonesia. So why is this important? Because these are the people that form the entire ecosystem. These are the people that are consuming the products that you're building. These are the people that are supplying the products in the marketplace that you're creating. These are the founders that you're going to be investing in. These are the employees that you're hiring in order to help you build and grow your unicorns. These are the executives and corporations that you're going to be talking to and negotiating deals for a strategic acquisition or a partnership. These are the regulators that you're working with for permits and licenses. Understanding their pain points, understanding their struggles, understanding their priorities is going to really allow you to build meaningful, effective relationships with the people in Southeast Asia. So we've heard all these statistics about the booming economy of Southeast Asia, but these statistics don't talk about the granularity of struggles that every 30-year-old or Southeast Asian faces. But as a business builder over the last 3 years, I understand the importance of these struggles. I understand that these struggles and these pain points affect the ability of any marketplace builder here to determine the average order values of their product, to determine their take rates, to determine the repeat rates and how frequently your users are going to use your product, how frequently they're going to come back to use your product. So it really does matter. And when you look at the income disparity between a Malaysian that's earning 3 times more than an Indonesian, It just means that you have to create very different, highly customizable businesses for each of the markets that you're operating in. So why are we then in Southeast Asia if it's so challenging to monetize the business, if consumption abilities are so weak at this stage? It's important to look at Southeast Asia for not what it is today, but for what it can become in the next 5 to 10 years. Growing population and urbanization, growing income levels, rapidly growing internet penetration rates, significant early investments that you make into Southeast Asia today will gestate now and yield returns in the future. So let's look at the income growth of a typical Southeast Asian today. Just in 2017, the annual income growth rate from Malaysians was at 7.7%. It averages at about 5 to 6% in Indonesia, Philippines, as well as Malaysia. Annual income growth rate. And you compare this against the income growth rate of the global average, that's only 3.2%. The Southeast Asian income levels are growing at almost twice the rate of the global average. And then you look at the young, hungry workforce compared to the aging workforce that is present in some of the other markets. 55 to 76% of this workforce is starting to urbanize, meaning they're moving from the outskirts of their countries into the cities to consume the products and the businesses that you're building. Internet penetration rate is at 51 to 71%. Number of internet users is obviously growing, as you're familiar with, and GDP growth is at 5 to 7%. Southeast Asia is going to be the 5th largest economy in the world by 2020. Right now, the GDP is equivalent to the GDP of the United Kingdom. The other question or issue is, does low consumption capability of Southeast Asians mean low connectivity or low network effects in any marketplace that you're building? I can tell you that from my experience in building a marketplace over the last 3 years, low income levels does not mean low connectivity. So I depend on a network of tens and thousands of service providers, from cleaners to contractors, plumbers, electricians, etc. 50 to 60% of their revenues come from my business on a monthly basis. They grow 50% monthly just on using my platform to connect to consumers. So stickiness on the supply side in my marketplace is extremely important. And this chart here and bar graph demonstrates how sticky the top 5% of my service providers have been on my platform. In any business that you run, the top 10% of your consumers contribute generally to 80% of your revenues. And the top 5% of my service providers have continued to spend more and more each month as we've continued to grow over the last 3 years. They've been doubling down. The number of purchases that our service providers make on the platform to quote for jobs, to accept jobs, because that's how I monetize. I monetize off the service providers. The rate in which they've been purchasing credits and the number of service providers that have been purchasing credits and spending on the platform has increased drastically over the last 3 years. And that's because network effects and liquidity does exist in Southeast Asia. When you build a marketplace with a lot of a variety of products and services, SKUs, for example, if you're an e-commerce service provider, people are going to come back to use your product for more and more things at greater frequencies. So you can see from my business, people come in for a cleaning service, and we cross-sell them renovation, cross-sell them aircon repair, cross-sell moving services, and that creates a lot of liquidity in the market. It generates a lot of demand on the supply side for my service providers, so they stick with me. So low consumption capabilities doesn't mean low connectivity in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of liquidity in a marketplace business in this region. Looking at the amount of investments that VCs have made into the region since 2014, 37% of investments have gone into e-commerce. And in 2014, 37% went into e-commerce. That means that these companies in 2014 have gotten better, faster, more efficient, and smarter over the last 3 years. These investments are going to gestate and yield significant returns today in 2017. Looking historically at the marketplace business, this is one of the oldest, most resilient, most dependable and reliable business models that you can build. It started off in the early 90s with eBay and Amazon, and then in the mid-1990s, the Indian marketplaces started to come out. And then just recently in Southeast Asia, did the Southeast Asian marketplaces start to appear. Groupon in 2010 and then Lazada in 2012. So it's still significantly early days for Southeast Asian marketplace. But globally, marketplaces continue to rule. Two of the most valuable companies in the world are marketplaces in the form of Uber and Airbnb, valued at 72 billion and 31 billion respectively. And similarly, in Asia, Meituan Dianping is now worth 30 billion, one of the top 10 most valuable companies in the world. Southeast Asia is no different. Lazada, Traveloka, and Grab were all founded in 2012, and in just 6 years, they're now worth more than 10 billion. Grab's worth 10 billion US dollars. So marketplaces solve real pain points that Southeast Asians are facing. It's true that Southeast Asians are consuming technology and using devices and using their mobile phones faster than people in other parts of the world. But just because the sophistication in which we're consuming media and consuming things is accelerated doesn't mean the pain points of Southeast Asians have accelerated. It doesn't mean the pain points that we're experiencing has become as sophisticated as the pain points of people in Europe or the US or in Scandinavian countries. No one wants an autonomous driving car here. No one wants a flying car here. People just want to make sure the bus comes on time. Southeast Asian pain points are the same as it is today as it was 10 years ago. Just because the technology has changed doesn't mean that pain points have changed. And marketplace businesses that are being created today are solving those pain points. So now we know that income levels are challenging and consumption abilities are challenging. But we know that the economy and income growth is going to really change things and change the landscape in the next 5 to 10 years. We know that marketplaces are resilient, robust, and dependable. So the question is, how do we accelerate the growth of marketplaces that you're building? Well, I think there are 3 things that you can do. One is you can continue to throw money at the problem. The second thing is to consider whether you should be building a managed marketplace rather than an unmanaged marketplace. And thirdly, to be growth and valuation focused rather than trying to optimize too early for revenues and margins. So accelerate growth with money. Examples of companies that have done this, Grab, Traveloka, Tokopedia. Over the last 3 years, they've spent a lot of money, but they've managed to educate consumers. They've managed to convert users. They've managed to grow their AOVs, grow their GMVs very, very quickly. It was a painful process over the last 5 years, but no one is going to question the results that have transpired right now, given how valuable these companies are. A lot more VCs in the US now are doing preemptive funding, meaning they're doubling down on companies earlier on rather than waiting for them to achieve certain milestones before going out to fundraise. By doing that, you give the founders and the entrepreneurs more time to focus on growing their AOVs, growing their take rates, growing their margins, growing their user base, etc., rather than going out and fundraising, which can take a lot of time. So that's one way to solve the problem, and that's one way to accelerate your growth. The second way is to determine whether your marketplace should transition to becoming more managed rather than more unmanaged. In the early 1990s, most marketplaces were unmanaged. That means they were dependent mostly on peer-to-peer reviews for trust. The intermediary didn't intervene between the supplier and the consumer in the transaction. They didn't assume risk. But more often now, marketplaces are evolving to becoming more lightly managed and fully managed. Let's look at Uber, for example. The review system that you have with your drivers and the passengers, they operate to filter out really crappy drivers so that you don't have to filter through all the shitty drivers and see which one you want. You as a consumer expects Uber to do that for you. Airbnb intervened to take beautiful photographs of properties to put it up on the platform because they didn't trust people to take great photographs of their properties. So background checks, guarantees, verification, getting involved in that transaction is getting more and more commonplace. Now you can transition to becoming a fully managed marketplace where you're controlling everything in a transaction. You're controlling the supply side. You're owning that supply side. And in Kaodim, in my business, we're already starting to see this evolution. We're now a very lightly managed marketplace where our review system is helping us weed out and penalize service providers that are not responding quickly enough, that are not meeting the standards in terms of quality. And when you look at fully managed marketplaces like Open Door, they're a real estate platform. Instead of allowing buyers and agents to transact offline themselves, they're buying the property up front so that you can get a guaranteed sale in 3 days instead of waiting 3 months. So for later stage market investors, I think if you've missed the boat on Grab and Traveloka and all these other guys, there's a new breed of marketplaces that are slowly emerging in this region. And they're all in sectors that have really high GMVs, and they're all emerging as leaders and champions in their own spaces. Kaodim for local services, and other players that are in F&B, car selling, B2B, fintech, etc. So 4 things to take away. Assess Southeast Asia for what it is. Don't benchmark Southeast Asia against some of the other markets in the world. Look at the numbers and say, Southeast Asia isn't a great market to invest in. Take it for what it is. It's a unique place. As long as a marketplace that you're building solves a unique problem and you're doing that in a way that's intelligent, whether as a managed marketplace or as a fully managed marketplace, history has shown that marketplaces have stood the test of time, and they will have longevity and a future in this region. Observe social and political development in the region. With the recent elections and the changes that we've had in Malaysia recently, that's going to really accelerate and complement that already very healthy GDP growth that we're experiencing. And then lastly, consider optimizing your business for growth instead of optimizing too early for revenues and margins, given how challenging monetizing a business today is in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.